December 15th, 1942, Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The freight train's whistle pierced the humid southern air at 03:47 hours, its mournful cry echoing across the pine forests that surrounded the sprawling prisoner-of-war camp. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison stood on the observation platform, watching as another endless convoy of munitions cars rolled past, the seventh that week. Each car bore the weight of America's industrial awakening. 155mm artillery shells, 30-06 ammunition, M1 Garand rifles fresh from Springfield Armory. Behind the barbed wire, Capitano Alessandro Toretti pressed his face against the cold mesh, counting, always counting. 112 cars, 113. The numbers blurred together like a fever dream, each boxcar a testament to something he was only beginning to comprehend. "Madonna mia," whispered Sergeant Giuseppe Benedetti beside him, his breath forming small clouds in the December chill. "How many trains is that today?" Toretti didn't answer. He couldn't. The mathematics were staggering, incomprehensible. In North Africa, his regiment had fought with rifles that jammed in the sand, artillery pieces that fired perhaps 50 rounds before mechanical failure, tanks that broke down more often than they advanced. Here, in this Mississippi backwater, he witnessed an industrial symphony that defied everything he thought he knew about warfare. The train stretched beyond the horizon, its cargo representing just one day's output from factories that never slept. Ford's Willow Run plant alone produced one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes, a rate that would have seemed like fantasy to the Regia Aeronautica, which struggled to maintain 50 operational aircraft across the entire Mediterranean theater. What the prisoners did not know, what even most Americans did not fully grasp, was that they were witnessing the birth of the military-industrial complex that would reshape the global balance of power forever. Morrison had seen the look before. It appeared on every Italian prisoner's face during their first week at Camp Shelby, the gradual dissolution of everything they believed about their enemy's capabilities. These men had been told they were fighting a nation of soft capitalists, a country more interested in Hollywood movies than military might. The reality was crushing. "Sir," called Sergeant Patricia Williams from the camp's administrative office, her voice cutting through the morning air. "The new batch of prisoners from Tunisia just arrived. Colonel wants you to oversee the orientation." Morrison nodded, stubbing out his lucky strike. The orientation process had become routine, yet it never lost its impact. 43 Italian soldiers stepped off the transport truck, their uniforms still bearing the dust of North African defeat. Among them, Morrison recognized the familiar hierarchy: career officers trying to maintain dignity, conscripted farmers grateful to be alive, and the occasional fascist true believer whose worldview was about to shatter. Toretti watched the newcomers with the weary eyes of a man who had already undergone his own transformation. 6 months ago, he had commanded the 132nd Armored Regiment's Reconnaissance Battalion, leading Fiat M1340 tanks across the Libyan desert. The M1340 weighed 14 tons and mounted a 47mm gun that could barely penetrate Allied armor at point-blank range. Its maximum speed of 20 mph made it a sitting duck for British Crusader tanks. Now, through the camp's perimeter, he watched American Sherman tanks conducting training exercises. Each Sherman weighed 30 tons, mounted a 75mm gun, and could sustain 25 mph across rough terrain. But the numbers told only part of the story. What truly staggered Toretti was the quantity. Intelligence reports suggested the Americans were producing 1,000 Sherman tanks per month. His entire regiment had fielded exactly 47 tanks at full strength. "The new ones always look the same," Benedetti observed, nodding toward the fresh arrivals. "Like they've seen a ghost." "They have," Toretti replied quietly. "The ghost of their own assumptions." Maria Castellano had never seen anything like Camp Shelby, and she had lived in Mississippi her entire 23 years. The daughter of Italian immigrants who had arrived in 1919, she served as one of the camp's translators, bridging the gap between American efficiency and Italian bewilderment. The prisoners' stories fascinated and horrified her in equal measure. They spoke of rationing so severe that Italian soldiers received 200 grams of bread per day when supplies allowed. They described ammunition shortages so acute that artillery units were limited to 5 shells per day during active combat. They told of aircraft grounded not by enemy action, but by lack of fuel and spare parts. Signorina. Toretti approached her during the afternoon work detail, his English careful but improving. May I ask you something? Maria nodded, setting down her clipboard. Around them, prisoners worked alongside American civilians, constructing new barracks to house the growing population of captured Axis soldiers. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Italian POWs were building their own prisons with materials more abundant than anything they had seen in their homeland. These trains, Toretti continued, gesturing toward the railway line where another munitions convoy was passing. How many factories make these weapons? Maria consulted her briefing materials. The numbers were classified, but general information was available for educational purposes. Well, there's the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, which produces about 4,000 M1 rifles per day. The Lake City Army Ammunition Plant in Missouri manufactures 1.5 billion rounds of small arms ammunition annually. Then there's... Basta! Toretti held up his hand, his face pale. Enough. The mathematics were devastating. Italy's entire small arms production capacity peaked at 200,000 rifles per year. The Americans were producing 20 times that number from a single facility. But the true revelation lay not in the numbers themselves, but in their casual abundance. These weren't desperate wartime measures. They were the natural output of an industrial base that had been retooled, not rebuilt. What nobody understood at the time was that this industrial transformation would outlast the war by decades, creating a permanent military-industrial infrastructure that would define American foreign policy for generations. The turning point came on January 8, 1943, during what the prisoners would later call the Day of Understanding. Morrison had arranged for a group of senior Italian officers to tour a nearby aircraft factory, a carefully orchestrated psychological operation designed to demonstrate American industrial capacity. The facility, a converted automobile plant, had been producing P-51 Mustang fighters for 8 months. Toretti walked through the assembly line in stunned silence. Workers, many of them women, moved with practiced efficiency, installing engines, mounting weapons, testing electrical systems. The noise was overwhelming. Rivet guns, hydraulic presses, the constant hum of machinery that never stopped. How long? He asked the plant supervisor, a middle-aged man named Robert Chen, whose grandfather had built railroads in California. How long what? To build one airplane. Chen consulted his production charts. Right now, we're averaging one P-51 every 4 hours and 12 minutes, but we're still ramping up. Ford's Willow Run is doing much better with the B-24s. Toretti's legs nearly gave out. 4 hours. His Air Force had taken 6 months to receive a single replacement aircraft, and that was before the Allied bombing of Italian factories had intensified. Here, in a converted car plant in Mississippi, they were producing fighter aircraft faster than his mechanics could perform routine maintenance. But the true shock came when Chen mentioned the cost. $5,985 per P-51 Mustang in 1943 dollars, equivalent to approximately $800,000 in 2024 currency. Italy's entire military budget for 1942 had been 13.8 billion lire, roughly $700 million in contemporary terms. The Americans were spending more on fighter aircraft production in a single month than Italy allocated for its entire war effort in a year. Dio mio, whispered Major Vincenzo Rossi, Toretti's former second-in-command. We never had a chance. Back at Camp Shelby, the psychological impact of these revelations rippled through the prisoner population like a contagion. Men who had fought bravely in North Africa, Greece, and the Soviet Union began to question everything they had been told about the war's progress. Benedetti, the sergeant from Sicily, had been a true believer in Mussolini's vision of a new Roman Empire. He had volunteered for service in 1940, convinced that Italy would claim its rightful place among the great powers. Now, sitting in the camp's mess hall, he stared at his dinner tray with hollow eyes. The meal itself was a form of psychological warfare, though the Americans probably didn't intend it that way. Each prisoner received 3,200 calories per day, more than most Italian civilians had seen since 1940. The bread was white and soft, the meat portions generous, the vegetables fresh. It was better food than many prisoners had eaten as free men in Italy. My brother wrote from Palermo. Benedetti told Toretti during evening roll call, "The ration is down to 150 grams of bread per day. Children are eating grass soup." Toretti nodded grimly. The letters from home painted a picture of a nation slowly starving while its enemies grew fat on abundance. American industrial workers earned wages that allowed them to purchase rationed goods on the black market. Italian workers, when they could find employment, earned barely enough to survive on official rations, when those rations were available. The contrast was more than economic, it was philosophical. America had mobilized its entire society for war without sacrificing its fundamental character. Factories that had produced automobiles now built tanks, but the workers still went home to suburban houses with electric refrigerators and radio programs. Italy had militarized its society so completely that civilian life had virtually ceased to exist, yet its military remained chronically undersupplied. What the prisoners were witnessing, though they couldn't fully comprehend it at the time, was the result of a catastrophic strategic miscalculation by the Axis powers. Hitler and Mussolini had assumed that democracies were inherently weak, that free societies lacked the discipline necessary for total war. They were spectacularly wrong. Morrison understood this better than most. Before the war, he had served as a military attaché in Rome, where he had observed Italian military preparations firsthand. The Italians had impressive uniforms, elaborate ceremonies, and stirring rhetoric. What they lacked was the industrial infrastructure to sustain modern warfare. "The thing about dictatorships," Morrison explained to his staff during a briefing, "is that they're very good at looking powerful. All those parades, all that propaganda, it creates an illusion of strength. But when you actually need to produce 10,000 tanks or 1,000,000 rifles or 100 bombers, you need more than propaganda. You need factories, skilled workers, raw materials, and efficient distribution systems." The numbers bore out his analysis. In 1942, the United States produced 47,136 aircraft, 24,997 tanks, and 70,565 artillery pieces. Italy, by contrast, managed 2,118 aircraft, 1,252 tanks, and 3,472 artillery pieces. The disparity wasn't just quantitative, it was qualitative. American weapons were generally more reliable, more sophisticated, and easier to maintain in field conditions. But the true revelation lay in the sustainability of production. American factories operated on 3 shifts, 7 days a week, with minimal disruption from enemy action. Italian factories, when they operated at all, faced constant shortages of raw materials, skilled labor, and electrical power. Allied bombing had reduced many facilities to rubble, but even before the bombing campaign intensified, Italian production had been hampered by fundamental structural weaknesses. Dr. Sarah Goldstein, the camp's psychiatrist, documented the psychological journey of Italian prisoners with clinical precision. Her reports, classified for decades after the war, revealed a pattern of cognitive dissonance that affected virtually every prisoner. "The initial response is denial," she wrote in her January 1943 assessment. "Prisoners insist that what they're seeing represents a temporary surge in American production, unsustainable in the long term. They cling to propaganda claims about secret weapons, about German technological superiority, about the inevitable collapse of the Allied coalition." Toretti exemplified this pattern. During his first month at Camp Shelby, he had dismissed the munitions trains as theatrical displays designed to demoralize prisoners. The Americans, he reasoned, were simply moving the same equipment back and forth to create an illusion of abundance. The illusion shattered when he was assigned to work detail at the camp's supply depot. There, he handled crates of equipment that bore manufacturing dates spanning the previous 6 months. The serial numbers were sequential, indicating continuous production rather than recycled displays. More damning still, much of the equipment showed signs of recent manufacture: fresh paint, protective coatings still intact, instruction manuals with current revision dates. "The second phase is anger," Dr. Goldstein continued. "Prisoners become furious at their own leadership for misleading them about Allied capabilities. They feel betrayed, not by their captors, but by their own government. This anger manifested in different ways. Some prisoners, like Benedetti, retreated into sullen silence. Others became vocal critics of fascist ideology, engaging in heated debates with die-hard believers. A few, particularly those from northern Italy's industrial regions, began to analyze the technical aspects of American production with professional interest. The final phase is acceptance, followed by a curious form of admiration. Dr. Goldstein noted, "Prisoners begin to appreciate the efficiency and scale of American industrial organization. Some express a desire to remain in the United States after the war, not as refugees, but as participants in this industrial miracle." What none of the prisoners knew, what remained classified until the 1970s, was that they were witnessing only a fraction of American industrial capacity. The munitions trains passing Camp Shelby represented less than 2% of total U.S. military production. The aircraft factory they toured was one of dozens producing similar aircraft at comparable rates. The true scope of American mobilization was staggering. By 1943, the United States was producing more military equipment than all other combatant nations combined. The gross national product had increased by 70% since 1940, driven primarily by military spending that reached $85 billion annually, equivalent to approximately $1.3 trillion in 2024 dollars. But the most remarkable aspect of this mobilization was its efficiency. Unlike the Soviet Union, which achieved impressive production numbers through brutal sacrifice of civilian welfare, or Germany, which relied increasingly on slave labor, the United States had increased both military and civilian production simultaneously. American workers earned higher wages, ate better food, and enjoyed more consumer goods in 1943 than they had in 1939. This achievement rested on several factors that Axis planners had failed to appreciate. First, America's industrial base was geographically dispersed and protected by two oceans from enemy attack. Second, the country possessed abundant natural resources, eliminating the supply bottlenecks that plagued other nations. Third, American industry had developed mass production techniques that could be rapidly adapted to military needs. Most importantly, the United States had mobilized its entire population, including women and minorities previously excluded from industrial employment, without resorting to coercion. Rosie the Riveter wasn't propaganda, she was economic reality. Women comprised 36% of the civilian workforce by 1945, up from 26% in 1940. African Americans migrated from the rural South to industrial centers in unprecedented numbers, filling critical labor shortages while earning wages that transformed their economic prospects. The psychological impact of these revelations extended far beyond Camp Shelby. Italian prisoners wrote letters home describing American industrial capacity, though military censors deleted the most sensitive details. Still, enough information filtered through to influence civilian morale in Italy. Giuseppe Benedetti's wife, Carmela, received a letter in March 1943 that fundamentally altered her understanding of the war. "The Americans have more food than they know what to do with," Giuseppe wrote. "They throw away bread that would feed a family in Palermo for a week. Their soldiers complain about the quality of their uniforms better than anything our officers ever wore." Such letters, multiplied across thousands of families, contributed to the erosion of civilian support for continued resistance. By mid-1943, Italian public opinion polls, conducted secretly by anti-fascist organizations, showed that 67% of respondents believed the war was unwinnable. This represented a dramatic shift from 1940, when 78% had supported entry into the conflict. The economic data supported popular pessimism. Italy's industrial production had fallen to 58% of pre-war levels by early 1943, while American production had increased to 190% of pre-war capacity. Italian civilian consumption had declined by 45% since 1940, while American civilian consumption had actually increased by 12% despite wartime rationing. These statistics translated into human suffering on a massive scale. Malnutrition-related diseases had increased by 340% in Italian cities. Infant mortality had risen to levels not seen since the 1920s. Meanwhile, American infant mortality continued its long-term decline, reaching historic lows despite the demands of wartime mobilization. The revelation of American industrial supremacy coincided with a series of military disasters that shattered Italian confidence in Axis victory. The surrender of the Africa Corps in Tunisia, the Allied invasion of Sicily, and the relentless bombing of Italian cities created a cascade of psychological and strategic defeats. Toretti learned of Mussolini's fall from power while working in the camp's motor pool, repairing American trucks that were newer and more reliable than any vehicles he had commanded in North Africa. The news came via BBC radio broadcast, translated by Maria Castellano for the assembled prisoners. Il Duce has been arrested, she announced in Italian, her voice barely audible over the camp's public address system. Marshal Badoglio has formed a new government. The reaction was immediate and complex. Some prisoners cheered, others wept. Many simply stared in stunned silence. For men who had sworn personal loyalty to Mussolini, the news represented more than political change. It was the collapse of their entire worldview. "What happens to us now?" asked Major Rossi, his voice hollow with uncertainty. Nobody knew. The Italian government's surrender in September 1943 created a legal and practical nightmare for prisoner administration. Were they still enemy combatants, allies, stateless persons? The confusion reflected broader uncertainties about Italy's role in the post-war world. But for Toretti, the political developments merely confirmed what he had already learned at Camp Shelby. Italy had never possessed the industrial capacity necessary for modern warfare. The trains full of munitions, the aircraft factories, the abundance of food and materials. These weren't temporary wartime measures, but expressions of a fundamental economic reality that Italian leadership had failed to comprehend. The true scope of American economic power became clear through seemingly mundane details. Toretti noticed that American guards discarded cigarettes after smoking only half their length, a waste that would have been unthinkable in Italy, where tobacco was so scarce that civilians collected discarded butts to roll new cigarettes. The camp's mess hall threw away more food each day than most Italian families saw in a week. Prisoners working in the kitchen reported that American soldiers complained about the quality of canned peaches, meat that Italian civilians hadn't tasted since 1941, and white bread that had become a luxury item throughout occupied Europe. These observations weren't merely anecdotal. They reflected systematic differences in resource allocation and industrial efficiency. The United States had increased food production by 23% since 1940 while simultaneously feeding military forces that numbered over 12 million by 1943. Italy, by contrast, had seen agricultural production decline by 31% due to labor shortages, equipment failures, and disrupted supply chains. The contrast extended to every aspect of material culture. American prisoners of war in German camps received Red Cross packages containing chocolate, cigarettes, and canned goods that German guards often coveted more than their own rations. Italian prisoners at Camp Shelby ate better than most Italian civilians, yet their meals represented standard American military fare. Nothing special, nothing luxurious by American standards. "They don't even realize how rich they are," Benedetti observed during one of his increasingly frequent conversations with Toretti. "To them, this is normal. This abundance, this waste, it's just how they live." The observation was profound. American industrial capacity wasn't the result of wartime sacrifice and mobilization alone. It reflected an underlying economic system that generated wealth at unprecedented rates. Even during the Great Depression, American per capita income had exceeded that of most European nations. The war had simply revealed the full potential of an economic engine that had been running below capacity for a decade. Beyond the material abundance, Italian prisoners encountered cultural attitudes that challenged their fundamental assumptions about society and warfare. American guards treated prisoners with casual professionalism rather than ideological hostility. They followed Geneva Convention protocols not from fear of retaliation, but from institutional habit. This approach reflected broader American attitudes toward the war itself. Unlike their Axis counterparts, Americans generally viewed the conflict as a necessary but temporary interruption of normal life, not as an existential struggle requiring total social transformation. They fought efficiently and effectively, but without the apocalyptic rhetoric that characterized fascist and Nazi propaganda. Maria Castellano observed these cultural differences during her daily interactions with prisoners. "The Americans don't hate us," she translated for a group of newly arrived POWs. "They think we were misled, but they don't consider us inherently evil. They expect the war to end, and they expect to go back to their normal lives afterward." This attitude was both reassuring and disturbing to Italian prisoners. On one hand, it suggested that post-war reconciliation was possible. On the other hand, it implied that Americans viewed the entire fascist experiment as a temporary aberration rather than a serious ideological challenge. The implications were profound. If Americans were right, if fascism was merely a historical mistake rather than a viable alternative to democratic capitalism, then everything Italian prisoners had believed about their cause was fundamentally wrong. The trains full of munitions weren't just evidence of American industrial capacity. They were proof that democratic societies could mobilize more effectively than totalitarian regimes. The final revelation came in April 1943, when Toretti was selected to participate in a prisoner exchange program. Seriously wounded Italian officers were being repatriated through neutral Switzerland, and Toretti, who had suffered shrapnel wounds in Tunisia, qualified for release. As he prepared to leave Camp Shelby, Toretti found himself reluctant to return to Italy. Not because he had grown comfortable in captivity, but because he dreaded confronting the reality that awaited him at home. The letters from his wife painted a picture of a nation in collapse. Cities bombed to rubble, civilians starving, young men dying in hopeless battles against increasingly overwhelming odds. "What will you tell them?" Morrison asked during their final interview. The question wasn't casual curiosity. It was part of a systematic intelligence-gathering effort designed to assess the psychological impact of prisoner treatment on Italian morale. Toretti considered his response carefully. "I will tell them the truth," he said finally, "that we never understood what we were fighting against." The truth was more complex than simple military statistics. Yes, American industrial capacity was overwhelming. Yes, the material disparity between Axis and Allied forces was decisive. But the deeper truth was philosophical. Democratic societies possessed reserves of strength that totalitarian regimes couldn't match or even comprehend. This strength wasn't just economic. It was social, cultural, and psychological. Americans fought effectively because they believed in their cause, not because they feared their leaders. They produced efficiently because they were motivated by opportunity, not coerced by ideology. They sustained their war effort because it enhanced rather than diminished their fundamental values. The psychological transformation of Italian prisoners at Camp Shelby represented a microcosm of broader changes sweeping through Axis societies. As the war progressed and American industrial supremacy became undeniable, support for continued resistance collapsed throughout occupied Europe. The statistics were stark. In 1940, German intelligence estimated that 85% of Italians supported the war effort. By 1943, that figure had fallen to less than 30%. Similar patterns emerged in other Axis nations, though the decline was less dramatic in Germany itself due to more effective propaganda control and harsher penalties for dissent. The economic data told the same story. Italian war production peaked in early 1942 at roughly 40% of American levels, then declined steadily as raw materials became scarce and Allied bombing intensified. By mid-1943, Italy was producing less military equipment than it had in 1940, while American production continued to accelerate. But the most significant impact was psychological. The revelation of American industrial capacity shattered Axis assumptions about democratic weakness and totalitarian efficiency. Prisoners returning from American camps carried this knowledge back to their home countries, where it spread through informal networks despite official censorship. The effect was cumulative and irreversible. Once populations understood the true balance of industrial power, continued resistance seemed not just futile, but criminally wasteful of human life. This realization contributed to the collapse of Italian fascism, the erosion of German civilian morale, and the eventual surrender of Japan after the atomic demonstrations made American technological superiority undeniable. Toretti returned to Italy in May 1943, just 2 months before the Allied invasion of Sicily. He found a country transformed by 3 years of war, but not in the ways fascist propaganda had promised. Instead of a new Roman Empire, he discovered a nation exhausted by conflict it could never win. His hometown of Brescia bore the scars of Allied bombing, but the damage was selective and strategic rather than indiscriminate. American bombers had targeted industrial facilities with precision that would have been impossible for Italian aircraft, even if Italy had possessed the fuel and pilots necessary for strategic bombing campaigns. The contrast was emblematic of broader technological disparities that had doomed the Axis cause from the beginning. American forces possessed radar, advanced communications equipment, sophisticated navigation systems, and logistical capabilities that enabled sustained operations across vast distances. Italian forces relied on equipment that was often obsolete before the war began, maintained by mechanics who lacked spare parts and supplied by a transportation system that barely functioned under peacetime conditions. "We were fighting the future with tools from the past," Toretti wrote in his post-war memoir published in 1955. "The Americans showed us what industrial warfare really meant, and we realized that everything we thought we knew about military power was wrong." His assessment was shared by military analysts across Europe. The German General Staff, reviewing intelligence reports from repatriated prisoners, concluded that American industrial capacity exceeded their most pessimistic estimates by a factor of 3. Japanese planners, reading similar reports, began to question the wisdom of continued expansion in the Pacific. But the most profound impact was on post-war European development. The revelation of American economic power convinced European leaders that reconstruction required fundamental changes in industrial organization, labor relations, and international cooperation. The Marshall Plan succeeded partly because Europeans had already learned to respect American economic capabilities through bitter wartime experience. The trains that rolled past Camp Shelby in 1942 and 1943 carried more than munitions. They carried the seeds of a new international order. The Italian prisoners who watched those endless convoys were witnessing the birth of American global hegemony, though they couldn't have understood the full implications at the time. The industrial capacity that overwhelmed Axis resistance didn't disappear after 1945. Instead, it formed the foundation for American leadership in the Cold War, the space race, and the technological revolution that followed. The factories that produced Sherman tanks retooled to manufacture automobiles, appliances, and eventually computers. The organizational techniques that enabled mass production of military equipment found civilian applications that transformed global commerce. More importantly, the psychological impact of American industrial supremacy shaped international relations for decades. Allies learned to depend on American economic support, while potential adversaries learned to respect American productive capacity. The Soviet Union's decision to compete through military spending rather than consumer goods reflected, in part, Stalin's understanding that America's true strength lay in its ability to produce both guns and butter simultaneously. The lesson wasn't lost on subsequent generations of leaders. Chinese economic reforms after 1978 explicitly sought to replicate American industrial success through market mechanisms and technological innovation. The European Union's emphasis on economic integration reflected European recognition that political unity required industrial coordination of the type Americans had achieved during World War II. For the individual prisoners who experienced this revelation, the impact was deeply personal and lasting. Many chose to remain in the United States after the war, contributing their skills and perspectives to the country that had defeated them. Others returned to Italy with a new understanding of what modern societies could achieve under the right conditions. Benedetti settled in Detroit after the war, where he worked for Ford Motor Company until his retirement in 1978. His letters to relatives in Sicily described an America that fulfilled the promises fascist propaganda had made but never delivered: steady employment, decent housing, educational opportunities for children, and social mobility based on merit rather than political connections. Toretti returned to Italy, but maintained correspondence with American friends for the rest of his life. His post-war career as an industrial consultant reflected lessons learned at Camp Shelby about efficient organization, quality control, and worker motivation. He played a small but significant role in Italy's economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s, helping to modernize manufacturing processes that had lagged behind international standards for decades. These individual stories multiplied across thousands of former prisoners, creating informal networks of knowledge and experience that facilitated post-war reconstruction and reconciliation. The men who had witnessed American industrial power firsthand became advocates for modernization, democratization, and international cooperation. Their influence extended beyond economics to politics and culture. Many former prisoners became active in Italy's post-war democratic parties, bringing perspectives shaped by their American experience. They understood that democracy wasn't weakness. It was a source of strength that totalitarian regimes couldn't match or counter. By war's end, the statistics told a story of overwhelming American industrial dominance. The United States had produced 324,750 aircraft, 102,351 tanks, 372,431 artillery pieces, and 87,620 warships. These numbers dwarfed Axis production by margins that would have seemed impossible in 1940. But the true measure of American achievement wasn't quantitative, it was qualitative. American equipment was generally more reliable, more sophisticated, and easier to maintain than Axis alternatives. American logistics enabled sustained operations across multiple theaters simultaneously. American training produced competent personnel at rates that Axis nations couldn't match. Most importantly, American society had mobilized for total war without sacrificing its fundamental character. Citizens enjoyed higher living standards in 1945 than in 1940, despite 4 years of global conflict. Democratic institutions had strengthened rather than weakened under wartime pressures. The economy had grown more efficient and productive through technological innovation and organizational improvement. This achievement represented more than military victory. It was proof that democratic capitalism could outperform totalitarian alternatives under the most demanding conditions imaginable. The Italian prisoners who witnessed this transformation carried that knowledge back to Europe, where it influenced reconstruction efforts and political development for generations. The trains that passed Camp Shelby had delivered more than ammunition to the front lines. They had transported the building blocks of a new world order, one in which American industrial supremacy would shape international relations for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The revelation experienced by Italian prisoners at Camp Shelby offers a timeless lesson about the relationship between economic systems and military power. Totalitarian regimes may appear strong through propaganda and ceremony, but their true capabilities are revealed only under the stress of sustained conflict. Democratic societies possess hidden reserves of strength that become apparent only when fully mobilized. Their apparent inefficiency in peacetime masks an underlying capacity for rapid adaptation and massive production when circumstances demand it. The trains never stopped rolling, and neither did the future they carried forward into history.